All right. I've been looking at my own relationship with the media for quite some time, especially in the last year and a half. And honestly, there's an expression that I learned from my sister, and it's double what. It's not just what, it's just double what. And so you know what I'm talking about. And there's a certain kind of hit that comes from saying double what. So that might be the problem right there. So His Holiness the Dalai Lama has pointed out many, many times that it's really up to the mass media, including internet, to really cover stories that are human interest stories that show people doing things for others. And yet, even though he says these things, the media is just doing what it's doing. So we can complain about this, we can point out how this is, a grievous situation. We can do all of these things. I can feel like I'm a victim of the media. But in fact, I'm the one responsible for what I read. And it's really coming down to me making very clear choices of what I expose my mind to. So I'm going to back up a bit. In my 20s, I was really convinced that engaging in anything political or anything in the news was contrary to being a bohemian. And I just sort of removed myself from that kind of activity. And it wasn't until in my late 20s I met a woman who was a survivor of a concentration camp. She was in the camp for 5 years, and then she escaped to Sweden, and then eventually she moved to Canada. She pointed out to me, and she said this in relation to everyone she was meeting in Canada, that you Canadians are so complacent. You have a beautiful country, and hardly anyone in the 80s when I was talking to her about this, hardly anyone was voting in civic elections or in federal elections. And she said, you could lose it all, just like Poland did. You should be concerned about what you've got and do everything you can to protect it. So that got me thinking. And I just saw that my point of view was very selfish and self-centered, and that it was really time to change that point of view. So it's important to stay informed about what's going on in the world. As practitioners, we need to know, but then we need to set limits on how much time we spend informing ourselves. So I'm thinking about my mind, and I'm not alone, that is extremely selective. We choose carefully. We choose carefully the clothes we wear, right? I mean, do you wear just anything out in public? No, of course not. You don't want to look like a goofball. And even in my 20s, when I was going through this phase of being a bohemian, I went to this Goodwill store, and I would spend a long time, and I hated shopping, but I wanted to get the coolest shirt that cost $1, so that I can come out of that store and look groovy and then brag about the fact I spent $1 on that shirt. We're selective about the food that we eat, very selective, and yet we don't engage our wisdom in our choices often. So we'll eat something that gives us a hit, but are we really taking a look at the long-term effect of what all that stuff has if it's not nutritious, about the fat content and the salt and the additives and what that does to our mind and how we can't concentrate after eating something like that? Well, in my case, previously, no. I just wanted the hit. So I'm looking at this selective mind, that just is selective and choosy, but not imbued with wisdom. And I've found that this is the mind I sometimes bring when I engage with the media, when I'm reading the news to get informed, because I need to be informed. So there's a few things that I've decided have to be important when I turn my attention to the news. And the first thing is, what is my motivation for even looking at the news? And is it really that I want to be informed, or am I deciding that I'm bored, I'm restless, I need a distraction, and I want something to just take me away from the suffering that's going on in my mind, and I might even not even know that it's suffering going on, but I just want something else. So I turn to something. And, is it really going to be of benefit for my mind? And this is the question now I'm asking myself. So I've decided now, with all the stuff that's going on, I don't have to be a victim of the media. I don't have to read every story on the front page of the New York Times. And if I do that, I'm just a mess. So I don't have to be a mess. And then I often turn to the Canadian news because, interestingly enough, There's more goodwill stories, and I'm sure I'm biased. I mean, if I spoke Latvian, I'm sure the Latvian news has lots of goodwill stories too. But there's lots of other stories going on that we can turn to. So then I'm very selective. Usually I read the obituary column. In fact, I always read the obituary column, and I just don't read the news in that type in the New York Times, because then I would just conclude it's the famous and the people who have done big things that die. So I turn to, maybe a place where I used to live, or the Newport News, which doesn't have an online thing, so I go somewhere else. But I look at the real fact of people dying every day at different ages. That's very helpful for my mind. Then the second thing is that if I just consume the news without engaging a Dharma perspective, then it's just like drinking pop. I'm thirsty, I grab something that's available, it's fizzy, it has sugar in it, it goes down the gullet, and then I'm really messed up for the rest of the day. And that's how it can be when we're not selective with the news. So I look for something that has people doing meaningful things or people engaging in virtue. I do take a look at the headlines to find out what's going on. And if it is a tragedy, then, later on I think about that and maybe do some tonglen about that story, but really reflect on the misery and the suffering of being in cyclic existence and looking at these stories as clear indications that this is how it is. Right now I'm in charge of feeding the cats every day. So I feed the cats, they're so happy with me, they get their food, and then if they see me heading to the same place where the food is stored a few minutes later, they put on this big show that they're starving to death. So, of course, I don't fall for it. But, a cat mind has so few choices. What do they have to do with their mind? They can eat, they can sleep, they can go outside and sniff things. And if we're not careful, they'll go outside and kill things. So, we have more potential than that. When we're bored, when we're distracted, how about doing something virtuous with our mind? And that includes looking at the media and looking for things to inspire us. So I actually had chosen the story that Venerable Jigme selected yesterday, but it was actually easy to find two others. And actually the first story was sent to me by Julia, who lives in Ukraine. And this story was in the Canadian news, and I thought, what in the world is a Ukrainian woman doing reading Canadian news? But this particular story was picked up by BBC. So it's a very inspiring story, and we can come at it with a Dharma perspective. And it's short. So the story starts off. No one likes a dull wedding, but one father of the bride's speech was a little too electrifying at his daughter's ceremony last weekend. So this fellow was struck by lightning giving a speech at his daughter's wedding in an apple orchard in New Brunswick, Canada. So aside from a small scar on his thumb, this fellow says he was unscathed and the wedding proceeded. So here's what happened. Storm clouds had gathered behind him at the ceremony, and his daughter saw lightning strike the ground nearby. He was holding a microphone, and the shock jumped into the sound system, and he says his hand lit up, just like a light bulb, and he saw the spark. And he was looking at his hand, and it was all flared up, and it was like he was holding a lightning bolt, he said. So everyone in the wedding party was stunned at first, but that didn't stop the wedding, so they figured out he wasn't dead yet. So he continued with the speech, and on they went. Now, this particular fellow was working on a cruise ship in 2015, and he was working near the Falkland Islands. The ship caught fire, and he was rescued by the Royal Air Force. So he says of himself, I've had lots of brushes with death, but death keeps ignoring me. So from a Dharma point of view, many causes and conditions came together that afternoon for this fellow to die. The chances of being struck by lightning are about 1 in a million. But the good news is that 1 in 10 people actually survive it. So, usually what happens is you're struck by lightning, your circuitry is just, jolted out of, total rhythm, and you die of cardiac arrest, or you're just burned up from the inside out. But all he has apparently is a scar on his thumb. So he was very fortunate. So again, from a Dharma point of view, he didn't have the karma to die that particular day. Another story that was really delightful to read good news story was from the New York Times, interestingly enough, and I'll just summarize it. So there was a ballet dancer and his wife, who's also a ballet dancer, and their mother, who were going home late one night in New York City. And they were on the tracks, and all of a sudden they see this man and woman start to fight with each other. And the woman was much younger, and she ended up pushing this fellow onto the tracks. And the fellow hits his head on the tracks and goes unconscious. And so everyone who's around this is screaming, saying, help, 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 help. And I should mention that the ballet dancer, who's the male, wasn't dancing that night. He had just gone to see his wife dance because he's recovering from a herniated disc. So he's looking around at everyone just screaming, and this guy is on the tracks, and they hear the train coming. And so because of his training, even though he's injured, he jumps down to the tracks. He's trained to do a lift. He picks up this man who's unconscious and lifts him up to the platform. And then he realizes that he's still down below, and he's injured, and then just adrenaline takes over, and he leaps up from the lower level back up onto the platform where his wife and mother is. And he said it was only then, when his wife started crying, that he realized how dangerous this was. So here's a story where, this is what we would all love to do, that without even thinking, we jump to someone's rescue. Now, of course, we're all limited by our physical capacity. This person had the physical capacity to help. He could do it, and he did it. And everyone else was just, screaming. So it's these kind of stories that inspire me. It's what I look for. If I give myself 10 minutes a day to look at the news, that's how I'm going to use my time. But then I always ask myself now, especially with the double what coming out of my mouth, what's better to do with my time? Look at this? Or how about reading a Dharma book? Or going for a walk and reciting mantra? Or sitting on the cushion and thinking about something else I read earlier in the week? So we don't have to be a victim of the media. I don't think the media is going to change its game anytime soon, despite what His Holiness says. Some journalists will, but we can really be the ones that determine how we use our time.